All right, good evening, everyone. How are you? Good evening. So I am really excited, and I was thinking about why I'm so excited. There are three reasons, and this is not going to be on the radio part of the program. It'll start to be very formal suddenly. You'll get to know, you'll figure that out when we're starting to record. So I'm really happy as I thought about it because, one, it's the holidays. And happy holidays. I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. And, I know my family definitely is looking very much to Christmas and the holidays and the electronics, unfortunately, which we will talk about. The second thing is I'm excited to be here to be leading the World Affairs Council. This is just, I've admired the organization from afar. We do some really, really cool things. And I'm looking forward to trying to, and Jane Wales, what did someone tell me? You've got very big shoes to fill. That was the first thing. And it says, oh, you're the one. That was the other kind of comment that was made. But yes, Jane did a tremendous job here. But I'm looking forward to building on what she has created. And I hope that for all of you who are members, please, I look forward to getting to know you. For those of you who are not members, please participate. And if you want to become members, great. If not, please continue to come. But I look forward to hearing sort of what excites you about the organization and how we might be able to make some tweaks and changes to be more responsive to what you want. That's something that's going to be very important to me as we try to figure out as we go into the next phase of the organization. And I'm not really sure what that's going to be exactly, but I know it's going to be a lot of fun. I think the staff is energized, and we've got a lot of different ideas that we'll throw around with folks. And then finally, the third reason is that, as Julia said, this is my first public event where I'm actually here formally. A couple events earlier, I shook hands with people, and everyone was going, who are you? As I'm sort of sitting there greeting everyone coming in. And I think that the staff chose a particularly perfect individual for me to interview, and a very compelling person for us to interview. And we have Rana Foroohar. Please give her a hand.
Thank you. Thanks.
She, as Julie was saying, she's a journalist of very great reputation, and she's written a book, which I think all of you have copies of, which is Don't Be Evil, How Big Tech Betrayed Its Founding Principles and All of Us. And there's so much material in here that I had trouble trying to figure out how we were going to consolidate and have a really interesting conversation. So what I wanted to do is we're recording, so why don't we get into this right now?
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
All right. So good evening, and thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to be here to have a conversation with Rana Foroohar. She joins us tonight to discuss her new book, Don't Be Evil, and how big tech betrayed its founding principles and all of us. So Rana, you've done a lot of writing about international financial industry and big tech. But there's one sentence that you write, which I found, it just socked me in, it just hit me in the head as I looked at it. Like, oh my gosh. To write, and I'm going to paraphrase this, and you can find this in the book. Today's most powerful companies, and she's referring to Facebook, Amazon, Google, Netflix.
Don't forget.
Right.
Don't forget them.
Are bifurcating and distorting our economy. 2, corrupting our political process. And number 3, fogging our minds. Okay? Now, that's pretty strong stuff, right? And I want to talk about each of those as we guide our conversation for this evening, to talk about those things and pull on those. But I thought it was really important to start off with, I think, really a foundation, and that has to do with data. The common thread that runs through all these assertions is the value and centrality of data and personal information as big tech has matured. And, you say data is, the oil of the 21st century. So why don't you sort of let's talk about that and give everybody some background as we move forward.
Well, a lot to cover there.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to do in this book was really try and knit together an economic, political, and social story, because that's what big tech encompasses. It is the stuff of our lives. You have probably everybody here who has a smartphone on them right now in the audience.
Anyone?
Everyone has, the power of essentially a mainframe computer 20 years ago in their pockets today. You probably touch that phone several hundred times a day. One of the companies that made it is likely amongst these 4 players that I'm talking about. Those companies, the companies that are richest in data, and we can talk more about what that is in a minute, and intellectual property, now represent 80% of corporate wealth in America. So that is a tremendous amount of power. And that economic power has translated into political power. I talk about this in my book in 2 ways. First, the fact that big tech is now the single largest lobbying entity. Google and Amazon are the biggest individual corporate lobbyers in America right now. So this industry as a whole vies with Wall Street and Big Pharma for spending the most money on political lobbying. And there's, of course, the disintermediation problem, the filter bubble problem, the fact that many of us are now getting the majority of our news and entertainment from platform technologies which are designed to give us more of what we're clicking on. And so they take us to what we've already seen. If you're clicking on cats, you're going to get more cat videos. If you're clicking on left or right-wing propaganda, you're going to get more of that too. And so this sort of bifurcation of the individual is part of the business model. And when I looked for a way to tell this very complicated story, and as you mentioned, one of the things in my first book, which was about the financial industry, I didn't have a single narrative arc. I kind of jumped around, and I found that it's really important when you're dealing with a topic this complicated to try and find a single storyline. And at the time I started writing it, or thinking about it, which was in 2017, Facebook was really the company that had come in for the most backlash, and that's still perhaps true today. But if you look at the origins of what Shoshana Zuboff, who I know you've had here to speak as well, would call surveillance capitalism. So the idea of your individual behaviors and preferences being monitored and tracked in a variety of ways, that informing algorithms that then are sold back to you in the form of what seem to be free transactions where you're getting search or you're getting apps or you're getting services for free. Well, that's information that's being harvested from you and is then returning to you in the form of algorithms that will push you in whatever direction is best for the companies that are selling you these things. And this is something, this business model, when we can talk a little bit about the origins of that and why Google really represents this arc best, that's something that has now come out of the big 4 or 5 tech companies and is going into every industry, is going into healthcare, is going into finance. It is really the business model of our time, and that's why I think it's so important to explain how we got here, what this 20-year arc has been, because I think that we're really now at an inflection point about what do we want the rules of this new game to be? How do we structure the rules of this new digital society that we're in a way that is not incompatible with liberal democracy and free markets? So
why don't we talk a little bit more about the data? Because you were talking about the business model, and one of the things that people traditionally think about search is just and Google about search, right? But one of the things that I had read, that when someone had talked with one of the founders, I don't know it was Sergey or Larry Page, they were saying, well, Google is not really about search, it's about data, right? And the model has changed. I mean, Google originally, and the book's title is Don't Be Evil, right? And Google at the early point in time was about search and trying to help the world and all this. And suddenly there was a transformation that you talk about, which is not unusual, but there are reasons for it. And why don't you talk about that, and then we can, I think that's really an important sort of feature now.
No, for sure. So when Google was first founded, and actually you can go back, as I did, to the very first paper that Larry and Sergey wrote when they were graduate students at Stanford in 1998. They lay out what the search engine would do. It was designed to sort of conglomerate all the world's information and make it something that you could sift through. They laid out what that would look like, how it would work, and then how you might monetize it in the form of, of a business model. And you have to read to the very, very end of the paper, which this actually proves one of my theses in the book, which is that people are reading less and less, because hardly any journalists that I know have read to the end of this paper, even people that cover the tech industry. But if you do, if you get to page 33, you'll see that, that there is a section on using advertising to monetize a search engine. It's called Advertising and Its Discontents. And they actually lay out the idea of using targeted advertising and looking at you or as individuals, harvesting the data and then selling that to advertisers and using that to create this free search engine. And they said that if that was the case, if that's the way you monetized a search engine, then the interests of the users and the interests of the advertisers, be they companies or public entities that want to reach you, of whatever form, they would just by definition come into conflict with each other. And so they actually didn't want to use targeted advertising in the beginning.
Right.
And they tried different models. They tried more sort of plain vanilla forms of advertising. They tried subscription. But eventually, as the venture capitalists were sort of saying, all right, what's the business model? You're making some money, but you're not making 10, 20 times, what we want to get for the investment that we've had. Then they started to move to this targeted advertising model.
Which in certain ways, the way you described it, just completely changed the whole landscape, right?
I mean, that's really the beginnings of what we would now call surveillance capitalism.
Okay.
The idea that your behavior is being tracked and sold back to you.
So that's a perfect segue into how big tech is bifurcating, altercating, distorting our economy and the world that we live in. I mean, one of the things you talk about is how the new economy is turning people, quite literally, into factory inputs for the digital age.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, it's a pretty strong word, but let her explain this.
Well, so there's a lot here. Let me pull back maybe for a minute and kind of put this into what I see as a big historical arc. So I think that we are probably 20 years into what is going to be a 70-year economic transformation. We are in the process of shifting from being an economy that is tangible, made up of things that you can see and touch and feel, to an economy that is essentially intangible, something that is based on data and intellectual property. And so we've come through 20 years of that. Really, the mid-1990s is when you could kind of put the marker. We're now moving into data being the oil for every company. That's going to roll out over several decades. That changes a lot of things in the economy. It changes the nature of employment, for starters. So if you look at the companies that own the most corporate wealth right now, they have the same market cap as, say, the previous generation of technology companies, a Microsoft or an IBM. They have the same market cap as the big industrials of the past, relatively, but they create far fewer numbers of jobs as a percentage of that market cap. So that's point number one. The entire relationship between corporate growth and labor is changing. And we can dig down into that a little more deeply. I have a whole chapter on the sort of Uberization of the economy and what that's going to mean. It also changes the nature of investment. So with the rise of an intangible economy has come actually lower investment into Main Street. So one of the big economic mythologies of the last couple of years that was sold by the Trump administration was that, all right, the big tech companies have tons of money overseas. They're holding it because our tax rates are too high. If we just lower our corporate tax rates, they're going to bring all that money back and they're going to pour it into Main Street and there's going to be tons of job growth. Well, no, that's not what happened, because that's not how these companies work. What happened was some money came back, about half of what the administration said would come back. That almost all of it went into share buybacks. So these companies essentially bought back their own stock, which artificially raises the price of the stock. That's one of the reasons that we have this bizarre situation right now where Wall Street is way up here, but Main Street is down here. We still have kind of below 2% growth in the real economy, but you have asset prices at record highs, but it's a kind of a saccharine growth. So that's another point. There's a second part of your question that I'm losing because there's so much to cover here.
About the digital factory inputs and how things have changed over the years.
Right, and then now there's this economy that's based on data instead of oil or widgets, and you are that input. So think about if GM, for example, didn't have to pay any money for the steel that it used to build its cars. Think about what the profit margins would be. Think about that business model. That's the business model that big tech uses. You are a free data input. Now, that also creates, I think, a real fundamental problem in the free market economy. Because if you go back to Adam Smith, father of modern capitalism, he would have said that you needed three things for a market economy to function properly. You need equal access to data and information. You need transparency on both sides of a transaction. So when you're in a market, you and both the buyer and the seller need to understand what's being exchanged. You also need a shared moral framework. Now, you can say that none of those things is in play right now. When you're doing a free search or using a social media app or really anything you do on your phone, you're paying in data. You're not paying in dollars. Now, you don't know how much that data is worth, but it's worth a lot. And there are economists that are starting to put different measures on that. The point is, it's not a transparent transaction. And this starts to get us into other areas like why the big tech firms are under pressure now to, say, disclose political advertising. This is all part of the black box problem where the companies themselves understand the transaction, but everybody else around them, the users, the other companies that may be doing commerce on their platforms, doesn't have that equal access to information. And that means that the market is not functioning properly. And that's one of the reasons I think that you've seen greater and greater concentration of corporate power in just a few companies.
So let's talk about that. You were saying also that you were talking about how we're on the verge or the tip of a new era, right? And in the book and other places, you kind of equated at another time, back in the late 1880s, the railroads.
Yeah.
And the railroads, then suddenly there was a new era that went from the 1880s into the new modern era that was marked by World War I and that whole era, the beginning of the century, turn of the century. And you make that analog with railroads and these big tech platforms, all right? And I guess the thing that I found really interesting was here in Silicon Valley, the narrative is it's competition, innovation, and yet you're making the argument, and I think it's quite convincing, that in fact these large incumbents are in fact crushing innovation and competition in that way.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Competition and whether or not the free market space is working properly is something I've been studying for decades now. And my first book kind of got into some of the same territory too. Actually, it was about the financial industry, but I was looking for an example of the most dysfunctional market dynamic that I could think of. And what I found wasn't really in the banking sector. It was about Apple. And I went back a few years ago and I was looking at how, I don't know if you all remember the financier Carl Icahn, robber baron, hedge fund guy. A few years back, he owned a lot of Apple stock. And he was tweeting, every 5 minutes, Apple has all this cash on the balance sheet. They should hand this money back to shareholders. And inevitably, they would do that, and the stock price would go up. Now, why that was not considered market manipulation, I don't know. It used to be, and that's another thing we can talk about. But Apple was a company that didn't actually need any money to do their business, hadn't needed any operating cash since the 1990s. But they were engaged in this bizarre system where they would put money in overseas bank accounts to avoid paying U.S. taxes. This is all from a company that you could argue, as some economists would, is based mainly on monetizing things that were created by DARPA or the Defense Department, the internet, GPS, touchscreen. So that's one issue. They're then issuing lots and lots of debt on the U.S. public market and then using that to pay back shareholders, increasing the wealth divide. To go to your point about the 19th century robber barons, that's the last time we had these levels of asymmetries in the market and this level of corporate concentration. And there's another similarity, which is the idea of building networks and then owning everything on the networks. So if you think about the way the railroads used to operate, they built, the rails literally out here to the west. But then, for a number of decades before they were regulated, they could also own the cars that went over those networks. They could own the things that were in the cars, oil, grain, commodities of any kind. That clearly gave them disproportionate advantages. They actually even, I've been thinking a lot about similarities to today's paradigm with political disintermediation, Facebook, the Trump administration, whatever, name your problem. The railroad barons,
touch on that.
We'll come back to that. The railroad barons used to give politicians of their choosing free passes to ride to different areas that they wanted to campaign in. And only the barons knew how many passes were being given out. So there's a lot of similarities there. And eventually, the railroad barons were curbed because they were reformers, Louis Brandeis in the case of the 19th century Titans, that came in and said, look, this is too much power. The free market has essentially been bought by just a handful of players, and so you have to break these firms up. And I think that that's one of the reasons that you see Elizabeth Warren and some others saying, look, she uses break them up as a shorthand. That's not really a solution. But what she and others are talking about is maybe you can own the network. You can be a platform, but you can't own all the commerce on top of the network. And this is something, it's not just a matter of David and Goliath. It's a matter of Amazon is besting Walmart. There's such a disproportionate advantage when you own the network and the commerce that it really becomes a zero-sum game.
And so in your mind then, whoever controls the data ends up being the haves and the have-not, because you were talking about sort of the inequality and how that's just being exacerbated.
Well, if data is the new oil, and you have a handful of companies ring-fencing that data, in some cases, just owning it outright. It's, I'll just as a little side example here, Google has a project to do smart cities called the Sidewalk Project, which some of you may have heard about. And one of their launch pads for this is in Toronto. And so the company has taken over 12 acres of the Toronto waterfront, and they have put sensors all around to gather data. And it's a good idea in the sense that they want to study traffic patterns and energy grids and make things more efficient. But until quite recently, Google was going to own all of the data and have, sole access to that. Well, forget about, whether you or I are comfortable having ourselves monitored in that situation, or if the government of Toronto wants to be able to do anything else or decide, as a government, do we want this data to be used for this purpose or that purpose? You wouldn't even be able to have any other companies come into that ecosystem and play in it. So finally, a couple of weeks ago, the government said, well, actually, maybe we'll put it in a public database. But that's what I'm talking about. The ring fencing of the data and the network effects of these companies are just so powerful that they create real asymmetries in the market.
So I think this is a good time for us to talk a little bit about sort of how you got your perspective. One of the things that you make a confession. You make a confession that you worked in the tech sector during the early 2000s. I'll make a confession, I did the same thing too. I was in a VC during the early 2000s as well. So you have insight to sort of the tech sector at one point in time, as well as a journalist, as an outsider as well. And I think it might be really interesting for you to talk just briefly about the differences between, when you were in the tech sector and what it has become now.
Yeah. I actually worked in tech in Europe. I joined a high-tech incubator that was funded by Citigroup in London. And the idea was, I'm going to use some very arcane terms, the idea was to do B2C deals in the media space. I think I'm using the words that haven't been, business to consumer. It hasn't been used in 20 years. The idea was to connect the dots between Europe at a time when the European Union was coming together, the euro was becoming the common currency. And so the idea was, well, you wouldn't necessarily want to have a travel platform in the UK and France and Italy separately. You might want to incorporate all these together. So I kind of knew, frankly, when I went in that there was a very good chance that this thing would blow up, which it did. But I figured that as a business journalist, it was kind of a no-lose proposition, in that I would know a lot more about the industry after working in it, and indeed I did. But one of the things that I saw that actually worries me, because I see this times 10 now, is this very unholy alliance between the technology sector and the finance sector, really bidding up values, creating just a completely sort of false sense of how much a company is worth. And in many cases, subsidizing firms that were making absolutely no profits. And, hello, that's sort of where we are now. And you're beginning to see that bubble, start to, if not burst, definitely kind of cracks in the paradigm with an Uber or a WeWork coming out to market, or in the case of WeWork, having the IPO pulled because there wasn't enough interest. And people saying, all right, well, we've been in this sort of land grab for the last decade where tech firms are encouraged to go out like an Uber, undercut competitors, disrupt models, ignore regulations, not abide by any of the same rules that other businesses have to. And we should come back to that and talk a little bit about the loopholes in the industry. Yeah. But eventually, the rubber hits the road, and when a company goes public or starts to think about going public, profits actually start to matter. One thing I'm very, very worried about this time around that I think does not get enough play in the financial press, actually, is the way in which the tech companies themselves have become the new sort of too big to fail institutions. And so let me talk to you a little bit about what I mean by that. If you think about the way an Apple or a Google spends its money, a lot of the cash that they have on hand, which, as we've already talked about, they simply don't need to invest in Main Street because, that's not the business model. They're not building factories. They're not employing that many people. They're using a lot of software and free data input. So the investment model is different. So they have all this cash. Well, what do they do with it? They buy the debt of other companies. So when lots of companies go and offer bonds on the open market, they're now being bought by Apple or Google. And so in some cases, big tech firms are underwriting 30, even 50% of new corporate debt offerings. That's what Goldman Sachs does, except they're not regulated the way big banks are. So I actually, a couple of years ago, tried to look into this, and I called up a bunch of the firms themselves, got no answers. They're not required to disclose what's on their books in that sense. I tried to kind of understand how much potentially bad debt are these companies holding. I don't know. It's impossible to know. But what we do know is that there is a record amount of corporate debt out there in the world right now, and that most people that study the markets, myself included, think that the next financial crisis is going to come not from a big bank, but from a corporate debt bubble bursting. Yeah. And that's all part of this, again, this kind of unproductive, unholy alliance between the financial markets, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley.
Okay, so let's go to the second thing where we talked about big tech is corrupting our politics and our democracy. This may be familiar to a lot of people. One is election manipulation. I mean, you talk about how 2016 was a big year for big tech. There's all the things that we're familiar with, the spread of fake news, false advertising, polarization. Why don't you tell us kind of your take on what's happening there? Right.
Well, this kind of goes to one of the conversations I had very early in the process of writing this book. I had actually joined the Financial Times in 2017, and my mandate was to write about the world's biggest economic and business stories in commentary form. And the first thing I did was kind of follow the money, and then I discovered that 80% of corporate value was living in 10% of firms. Well, right about that time, we had just gotten the 2016 elections, and a tech veteran, Roger McNamee, who actually has his own book, Zucked. I don't know if you guys have seen that book, but
he was disinvesting from a lot of these.
He's disinvesting, no, for his sins, exactly. But a seed investor in Facebook and Google, and he had become very concerned about what he was seeing online and the way in which misinformation, very sexist, xenophobic advertising around Hillary Clinton, some of it appearing to come from the Sanders campaign, was leading people down these paths. And there's still some debate about to what extent that may have affected the election. But the bottom line is, there was disinformation happening on these platforms. And he had actually tried to warn the leadership at Facebook about this, didn't get very far. So he came and started talking to me about it. And what I realized was that you could connect the dots between this problem of political disintermediation, the issue of data as the new oil, and the monopoly power of these companies, in the sense that the model is all about splitting us. It's about splitting us into individual pieces. You can now be targeted. You may see not only different political advertising, but a different price for something. That's the model. It's about putting you into an individual silo. And if you think about how that breaks us apart, I mean, it not only disintermediates the free market, it disintermediates society, disintermediates democracy. And I just found that there was a real unwillingness on the part of a lot of the folks that I tried to contact about this in the industry to really take responsibility for this, even though, going back to this very point that I made, if you look at the roots of search, that paper in 1998, you can kind of see it all there, hiding in plain sight.
And then you talked about how the algorithms really go to what interests people more.
Right.
And the more controversial it is, the more people go.
Right, and unfortunately,
right?
That's the fake news problem. I mean, there's been a number of studies done. There was a very well-done study by MIT showing that they studied Twitter, actually, but it could have been any platform, showing that fake news was 6 times as likely to spread as real news. There's also been a number of studies done showing that false narratives, or narratives that play to your existing prejudices, and we all have them, tend to lodge in the mind and stay there. This is very concerning. I mean, this is, I would say, more a boomer crowd. Many of us are getting our news from platforms, but if you go to the millennial section of the demographic, which is now the largest labor bloc, largest voting bloc, although they may not show up as much as some of the older voters, they get now the majority of their news and entertainment from these platforms. So that is you're living in a post-fact world. Yeah. And this is all, and I think this is maybe a good time to talk about these special loopholes that have existed for the industry, these kind of get-out-of-jail-free clauses.
So just before we go, again, let's...
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's great. Let's talk about the loopholes, but the bigger story here is because big tech has so much money, they've got these armies of lobbyists and the thing that's happening in Washington, which, during the 1990s, they were not to be seen.
Right.
Now they're all over the place. And there's that symbiotic relationship that you've got that you talked about between lobbyists and big tech for a variety of reasons. So talk about that. I mean, it's...
Right. Well, as I said, if you just look at the numbers that you can see that are public, and big tech is in one of the top 3 groups. It tends to vary depending on what bits of legislation are up year on year, but it's big tech, big finance, and big pharma are year on year the largest single lobbying blocks. Google and Amazon, by different metrics, are now the largest single corporate lobbyists. Google in particular had a very tight relationship with the Obama administration, so you saw a lot of cycling in and out of the administration from policymaking positions back into the company, back into policymaking positions. And so you can like or not some of the decisions that were being taken or the policy ramifications, but there was that revolving door, similar to the revolving door between, say, Goldman Sachs or Treasury. So you now have an industry that is no longer a bunch of guys, kids in garages. It's a big machine. I mean, Google's lobbying operation is in a physical space that's bigger than the White House. So that kind of gives you a sense of where we are. There's also a tremendous amount of cognitive capture. And this is something I discovered when I was trying to find impartial academics to talk about a variety of the topics I was researching in my book. It's really hard to find them because most of them have been funded by one side of the debate or another, either a big tech company or a telecom company, either Apple or Qualcomm, either Google or Yelp. Everybody's been bought. And that influences the debate. It influences the journalists that are writing about the debate, and it influences the politicians. It's also one reason that I think we haven't had a very clear and honest public conversation about whether the industry should still enjoy some of the loopholes that it does. And so the biggest one is, just to use the wonky terminology, something called CDA 230, which is, it was part of the Communication Decency Act in 1996. And the idea was that when these platforms were starting, and, we all remember going on and using them, and they were kind of, something new, and who knows how many people were on them. The idea was maybe Google or Facebook shouldn't have to be liable for everything that was said or done by users on the platform the way, say, the FT or CNN or the New York Times would have to be. Well, that was 20 years ago at a time when they were not the largest media and advertising firms in the world, which frankly is what they are. I mean, a lot of times they want to have it both ways and say, we're platforms, we're not at all like traditional media companies. But frankly, if you look at the business model for Google or Facebook, 85–90% of the revenue comes from advertising against content. So I think it's really time to take a close look at that loophole. There have been a couple of things carved out of it. There was a very big controversy which continues around sex trafficking online and whether there should be special carve-outs to make the platforms responsible for that. I think that we should have some rules set around political advertising and disclosures of that. And we need to have a very open public debate about it. It should not be down. One thing I do think is I don't want Mark Zuckerberg deciding what gets censored. I would like the government to come up with a law that everybody has to follow.
Okay. So the other thing that is troubling about big tech and the political process and democracy is surveillance for political purposes. And the whole notion of stifling dissent. You talk about the work of companies like Palantir working with the LAPD. You talk about Amazon, at least initially, trying to use facial recognition. And then that calls into, so we're doing this now as a law enforcement sort of thing within the United States. There's tracking in different ways, but I guess the example that people are holding is China.
Yeah.
And in fact, we know that in Xi Jinping, right, in the province where the Uyghurs are, Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are, there's been a lot of reporting in terms of how the Chinese are using AI, 5G to be able to, monitor people in ways that are just scary and almost science fiction in the way they, and so for you, what are the implications on that matter, and what are the things that we should be, concerned about? Well,
what's happening in China, and to a certain extent, what's happening in the U.S. around things like facial recognition, big data policing, these are, to me, huge value questions that we need to make now as a society. I'll talk about China for a minute. I mean, I don't know how many people read the front page Times story today laying out how facial recognition and now DNA testing is being used to identify Uyghur minorities. Terrifying, right? I mean, China is a surveillance state. There is a system of social credits. I mean, it's literally like something out of an episode of Black Mirror, where if you are doing right-thinking things, then you can get your mortgage more easily or get your pension and health care. And if you're on the wrong side of whatever the state deems appropriate, then you may be downgraded. And that is a choice that the Chinese state has made. It has its own tech champions. One of the things that I find very disturbing that's going on right now, and this kind of gets into the realm of foreign policy and trade and kind of where we're going with globalization, you see people like Zuckerberg go up and testify in the Hill, and there was a wonderful bit of reporting last year that was done. A reporter, I think it was from Reuters, went up and took a picture of his notes, and one of the notes was, if you are asked about breaking up Facebook, just say that we're the national champion in the fight against China, because there's now this narrative that the Chinese tech industry is going to eat America's lunch if we don't have these big companies to protect us. But these big companies have the potential to surveil in the U.S. in the same way they're doing in China if we make that decision as a society to continue to allow that. And I think that's where we are right now, where, I mean, the horse has definitely left the barn, But you can have a debate about this, and this is a debate that's being robustly had in Europe. I actually just came from 2 weeks of book tour in Europe, and I can't tell you, there's such a rich, varied, deep debate going on right now about, all right, in this new industrial revolution that we are all in, where we're transforming into a digital society, what are the rules going to be? What are the limits going to be? Are we going to have data in the public commons? Are we going to allow targeted advertising in some areas but not others? Are we going to allow it at all? I think that's the debate we need to be having here right now, particularly around things like facial recognition and big data policing, which ironically was something that was first talked about as a way of getting rid of racism. In some ways, it has exacerbated the problem. I mean, you now have in LA, you have people that have no criminal record that can now be under surveillance because of layering of different data sets.
Right. So an offshoot of this that I think people would be interested in is because, you know, where San Francisco is located is the U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah.
And in that context, I mean, you have China, you know, as we talked about, is doing all this stuff.
Yeah.
It's, you know, trying to work on, you know, we have 5G, artificial intelligence, you've got big data, quantum computing, even there's this sort of arms race in a sense, right? And you put this in the context of what you call techno-nationalism, which you term. And I think, you know, former U.S. Secretary of Treasury, Hank Paulson, talks about the fear of an iron curtain falling between the United States and China. And he's largely worried that the U.S. and China, which had been very much linked and interdependent in terms of our economies of the global economy, are actually going to be what we call decoupled. That's the big word. That's the buzzword right now, where, you know, national security issues are now bleeding into economic issues, which are causing a rift or two poles in which the world is going to have to decide where they're going to go.
Right. So that's a huge topic. I almost feel like we need like another panel to to do decoupling. But let me pull back. One of the things I have to say, I've covered economics and business for 30 years, and a lot of us kind of saw this coming. I mean, I used to go to China 15 years ago and wonder, gosh, why are more multinational CEOs not worried about supply chain security? Because tension is rising in the South China Seas. China has made it very clear that they wanted to have their own separate ecosystem. I'll just give you one example. I remember this was well before the financial crisis. I was in China. I was doing something. China had just made green energy a big strategic sector. And I was interviewing the head of Vestas, which was a big Danish wind company that was in the market at the time. And they were #1 at that time in the Chinese wind sector. And I asked the CEO what the prospects were for the next few years, and he's like, well, they're pretty good. I think we're going to be in #4 place in 5 years. And I was like, wait a minute, you're in #1 place right now. Like, why do you, first of all, how do you know you're going to be 4th? That seems very precise. And what does that mean, that you're going to, you know, things are going to go downhill? And he's like, well, because that's what Beijing told us we're going to be. We're going to be in 4th place. And 3 national Chinese companies were going to move forward. And I just thought, wow, that tells you a lot. And I frankly think, and this comes back to really more the topic of my first book, which was short-term pressure from Wall Street, I think a lot of U.S. and European, I mean, to a lesser extent, European companies have just said, we're just going to play it for the quarter. And, you know, as long as the music's playing, you got to keep dancing.
Keep dancing.
And the rubber has now hit the road. And, you know, I am no Trump fan, but I will say that a lot of things that the administration complains about, they haven't handled the trade disputes the right way, but a lot of the things that they're complaining about are things that were also being complained about during the Obama administration. Yes. And oftentimes companies would go to the administration, I mean, you probably know this, that the companies would go to the administration for the last 30 or 40 years and complain, but then not want to put their names by things, not want to, and everyone's been kind of trying to pretend that there wasn't this one world, two systems problem, and we now can't pretend any longer. And I think that that's where we are.
So that is a big issue, and why don't we leave it at there? So let's shift gears one more time and go to the third prong, okay? You know, fogging our brains.
Yep.
Okay, so let's talk about that. You talked about what you term as technology as the most invasive part of big tech is the power to manipulate our thoughts, actions, and even our brains.
Yeah.
Okay. And you also say, you talk about how technology is hampering the ability of the entire generation. Okay.
Yeah.
So you had a couple stories I know about your son. We were talking.
Oh my gosh,
that was sort of interesting, and really one of the reasons why you wrote the book. And maybe you want to sort of wrap that and talk about that.
So yes, I have two children actually, a 13 and a 17-year-old, and my now 13-year-old son Alex was 10 when I started writing this book, and actually I had an incident with him, which was one of the things that made me think, by gum, I'm going to write this book. I came home. I'd been thinking about all the kind of big picture stuff that we're talking about right now. Came home one day in 2017, opened up a credit card bill, and I saw all these tiny charges like $1.99, $3, $5, and I started looking. There were lots of them, and they were all from the App Store. And I thought, God, I surely haven't bought that much music, or I don't, what am I? And so I went and I totaled them all up, and it was over $900, like $949 or something. I have it in the book. And then I thought, wait a minute, who else has my password? My son. So I go downstairs, and he's in his usual after-school position on the couch with his phone, and I say, Alex, we need to talk about this. What are these charges? And he kind of goes white. He says, oh, that. Well, it turns out that he had become addicted to one of these sort of free, again, I put in quotation marks, games, FIFA Mobile. It's a soccer game that he had downloaded.
Yeah.
And you get the game for free, but like many of these things, as you play, you're offered in-app purchases. So if you want to, move up the rankings, you have to buy virtual sneakers for your player, or, get virtual Ronaldo. So $949 later,
hey,
Alex...
I've been there. I know what that's like, too.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, Alex was at the top of the rankings, and, I was nearly $1,000 poorer. But this is something I don't know if you have children.
Yeah, no, I have a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old.
So have you had this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, almost everybody I speak to has had some experience.
$900, but yeah.
I know. He had to, but we split it, actually. I fronted half the money, and then he had to earn the rest from his lemonade stand.
Okay.
Little real world. And I will say in Brooklyn, you can move a lot of lemonade on a hot day at a good price. So, but what was fascinating to me is, this is he's a pretty honest kid, and he knows to ask for my password. But as I was interviewing him, I got very interested in this as a journalist. It became clear to me that he was not completely in control of his functions, and wasn't completely clear that real money was being spent. And so I went and I started looking at some of these games, and I became really fascinated by the engineering of what, this entire field is called captology, very Orwellian sounding. There's an entire industry devoted to the creation of what's called persuasive technology. And they use all the things you would think, B.F. Skinner and the dog clickers, intermittent rewards, casino gaming techniques to nudge you in certain directions. And these techniques are in all the apps that we are all using. Now, one of the, I think, most pernicious effects of this has been for younger people who spend a lot more time on their devices. There was really interesting census done. It's done yearly by Common Sense, which is Jim Steyer's group based here in California. They look after media for children's interest, nonprofit group. And he found that teenagers spend about 7.5 hours on their phone.
Right.
Wow. American average, okay, per day, 7.5 hours. And this has coincided. It's very difficult to find causality, but this has coincided with some really troubling trends, like greater levels of anxiety, greater levels of depression, a plummeting in reading. I mean, one of the things in the study that was so disturbing to me, and I witnessed this in my own household, tweens and teens now read, only a third of them read more than once a month. Long-form reading, be it on a tablet or a book, it doesn't matter, but long-form reading, only a third of them do it more than once a month for pleasure. So they'll do schoolwork, but they're not picking up books and reading them for pleasure. They're generally looking at videos, looking at high-speed data, tweets, memes, There's a kind of a new language that is literally, a lot of behavioral psychologists feel, starting to rewire the brain. And just anecdotally, I spoke to a lot of college professors as I was researching this book, and also some high school teachers that say there's a generation of students that are coming in and are simply not able to do the core curriculum of 200 pages a week of reading that many of us grew up with. So to me, that's very, very worrisome, because when I think about the deep thinking that it's going to require for the complex problems, climate change, all the things we're dealing with, resetting of globalization, we're going to need to focus.
Yeah,
and we can't focus now because we're living in an economy that's being run by attention merchants.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I love that term, attention merchants. And you were talking about, you cited a quote from someone, I believe it was Google, who said that, quote, an entire army of engineers at all these firms are working to get you to spend more time and more money online, and their goals are not your goals.
Yeah, that was actually Tristan Harris's quote. So Tristan is a former Googler. He was worked as the chief ethics officer for Google, and he was trying. He had it's not a contradiction in terms, but or actually, he eventually felt it was a contradiction in terms and left, but. He is a serial entrepreneur, and his last company had been sold to Google, and so he came in-house and was trying to get the company to start thinking about some of these nefarious side effects and start thinking about how you might alter the business models. And he decided he just was not getting a lot of pickup and went outside and started this nonprofit, which is now about thinking, how could technology be re-engineered? Because, I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of great stuff there. We all love our search. Many of us enjoy our social media, but how could we rethink and re-engineer these products and services so they could actually not keep us online longer and turn us into zombies so that our data can be harvested, but actually help us to get where we want to go more efficiently?
Okay. So, we talked about the bigger picture. We started kind of this notion, I think, about tipping point, which I thought is really appropriate to going to the next area that I want to touch on, and we have a few minutes to do this, because I think in many ways it's the most important part. And one of the reasons why it's close to me is because in terms of where we are in our organization at World Affairs, this is going to be a more important component into what we do. And it's essentially, how do we change? How do we make an impact? What are the things that we can do to address some of these issues? Because all of us are here not to be depressed and to say there's nothing we can do. The reason you wrote the book is to say, we can do something about this, right? And you devote a chapter related to that. So, and you give a sense of hope. And so what can we do? Everyday people, what can we do in the Bay Area? Well, we start with that.
So let me start at just a very personal level. I would encourage everyone, if they haven't, to try a digital detox. It sounds simple and maybe a little bit trite, but I think it's actually quite profound. I actually had a digital detox by force a few years ago. It was right before the Christmas holidays, and I had my company-issued phone. I dropped it on Christmas Eve into a puddle of icy water, and the IT guys had already decamped for the holidays, so I didn't get another phone for like 5 days. And I am telling you, it was like going off of cigarettes. I mean, I realized I was reaching in my pocket all the time. I mean, I'm a journalist and I'm on this stuff 24/7. I wish I didn't have to be, but I realized that a lot of the time that in the past might have been white space for me, my time in commute, waiting in a line, had been filled. It had been filled. And suddenly, who was I without the phone and without something to check and without something pinging all the time? And for me, that was a kind of a profound experience. And it really got me thinking about some of the issues about how I spend my time, my own creativity, how much of my thinking is just reductive or iterative or something that is kind of copied versus something that is original. So I would encourage folks to do that. The other thing is, lobby your congresspeople, because there is a very vigorous debate happening right now about how this industry is going to get regulated. And California is actually ground zero. I mean, a lot of people think that the big debate about tech regulation is in Europe. I actually think that what California is talking about in terms of privacy standards, in terms of transparency about how your data is being used, some of the really kind of seemingly radical, but actually not so radical ideas about things like a digital dividend or a digital sovereign wealth fund. You know, if data is the new oil, and all value is going to live in data, then how do we divide up that pie?
So the problem up to this point has been us as individuals, we cannot monetize our own, we don't have the opportunity to monetize our own personal data, right? So what you're talking about is trying to create a platform in which that can be done.
Well, and this is something that, you know, Governor Newsom has been talking about. A lot of folks in the tech community are sort of thinking about, you can't, it's very difficult. Data's value is exponential. It gets more and more as it is layered. So it's very difficult to say, pay you a micro payment for each transaction online. But it could be possible to say, have some kind of a digital tax. I mean, Joe Stiglitz, the liberal economist, would like to see a global digital flat tax that would go into public funds that could then be used for things like retraining or healthcare or pensions. And, you know, I think that that's something that California is very much ahead on. It is time to really start lobbying for these things. Because I'll tell you, there is a big counter-lobbying effort going on in D.C. right now to stop that happening. And to backtrack briefly to your point about China, I fear that in this tech trade war, the decoupling that we're in right now, that there is going to be a nationalistic argument used, well, don't regulate big tech because we need bigger the better to compete with China. I think that's bunk. I think the beauty of our system has always been, and frankly, a lot of the true innovation in Silicon Valley came from small firms, always has done. I mean, tons of research shows that innovation happens at the level of the academic, of the small firms. When companies get bigger, they tend to innovate less.
So essentially, you know, what you're talking about, and I think you term it, is do we pursue a top-down, which is China, which is from the top down, they make the choices, they choose the winners and the losers, or do we do what the United States has traditionally done in the West, which was basically bottom-up?
Bottom-up, and here I feel a little hopeful because I see some overlap between right and left. So a lot of Democrats think about this in terms of too much corporate concentration is bad for the labor share of income. So that's where they're coming from. But there's a lot of I'll say kind of Midwestern type conservatives, more moderate conservatives that say, we want the overall free market ecosystem to work better. We want small and mid-sized companies and innovators to have a shot at being in these markets. So there's starting to be an interesting political alliance there.
Okay. So I wanted to, I've integrated questions that people have given to us. So one question, Facebook and Twitter, banning political ads, good or bad? Why?
I really would like to see this done at a public sector level. I think we need to have Congress coming up with some rules about what is allowed, and all firms have to abide by them equally. I kind of, on the one hand, I kind of love Twitter taking a stand and saying, yeah, guess what? This is a problem. We're not going to put fake political advertising up without checking things. Ultimately, should companies be the arbiters of this? No, I don't think so.
Okay. And then, you know, there are a couple of questions that have to do with, you talk about why people care, should care about their data, but there is a question about how there's so many people who are apathetic about their data being collected. You know, and then in the Bay Area in particular, you know, we're so dominated by these, you know, the big tech companies here. You know, what can we do or what should be done? What are the things that you would suggest for some of us to be thinking about?
Well, you know, I can say I get a lot of calls from people in the VC community here and the startup community. They're worried. I mean, people in the Bay Area, I think, I mean, these firms, yes, they're huge presences, but they're still only 4 or 5 firms. If you think about the overall economy, I mean, this is an economy, as our most rich liberal democracies, that's made up of 60 to 70% consumer spending. You cannot have just 4 companies owning the economy. They don't create enough jobs and enough growth. You have to have the enrichment of the ecosystem. And I think, frankly, that we may see a big market correction led by tech that helps to, you know, start to clean out some of the excesses in the system.
Okay. And then let's close with let's talk about sort of the bigger picture and conclude. So I'm going to put you on the hot seat. So where are we going with all this? What's, you talk again about us being in the middle of this sort of epic transformation. We were talking earlier, in the conference room a little bit about how things are changing so much now. You have technology, you have sort of orientation about how our societies are organized, the disenchantment that's happening as well in Middle America. And, one model, surveillance capitalism and in different ways. So where's all this going in your mind?
Well, so I think we are really at a big inflection point. We were talking earlier about how we're at a turning point with globalization. We're at a turning point with foreign affairs. I think we're moving towards a kind of a bipolar or tripolar world where the U.S. and Europe and China are going to be sort of separate spheres. With either harder or softer borders, depending on how things work. And then we're moving from the tangible to the intangible. And that's a lot to be happening at once. And it's happening fast. And it's going to happen faster because everything that we've just spent a rather complicated hour talking about in the context of the consumer internet is now coming to the Internet of Things. There are going to be sensors in your shoes and in this glass and, in the lights. And so put everything we've just talked about on steroids. Now, if you think about, I think, where we are politically, why we're so divided, why things feel so fraught, that's part and parcel of the way I think globalization and sort of laissez-faire neoliberal thinking has worked for the last 40 or 50 years. Globalization was supposed to be about capital, labor, and goods being able to cross borders. But as it turned out, capital was able to cross borders a lot more easily than goods and certainly than labor. That was tough for people in certain parts of the country. There were big pockets of pain, not just here, but in pretty much all wealthy countries. Now, add to that this digital transformation. If capital can travel across borders fast, data can travel even faster. So we're at a point now where a lot of the problems we've seen are about to get a lot worse. But I think if we get the regulatory framework right, and if we have a public discussion, there's also the potential, maybe, for the labor share of the pie, which has been shrinking since the 1950s onward, to start growing, because if data is coming from us, if data is the new oil, and we can own some of that, either by it being taken back by the public sector, a digital dividend, some kind of resharing of that part of the pie, data as labor, then you could start to see a shift in some of these winner-take-all dynamics that I think have gotten us to the really bad political place that we're in. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, please join me in thanking Rana Foroohar. Thanks for having me.
CNN global economic analyst, Financial Times columnist, and the author of Don't Be Evil. Many thanks to you as well. I couldn't get to all of your questions, but I was able to incorporate a number of them, and they were just terrific. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Philip. Great conversation.
Yeah.